Hello, welcome to another episode of the Charity Impact Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Blake, and my role is to help charities to increase their income and impact. On the podcast, I speak to people who can share insights from their experience on a range of topics relating to social impact. You can find out more about my work and the podcast, including all episodes with notes and resources at kedaconsulting.co.uk. That's K-E-D-A Consulting. Please do let me know what you think of this episode. I'd love to know what you take away from it, what you find interesting, what I could do better. If you can leave a review on your podcast player or send me a message by email, LinkedIn or Twitter, all details are at kedaconsulting.co.uk. In today's episode, I talk to philanthropy advisor Emma Beeston. We talk about the role of the philanthropy advisor, the types of philanthropists Emma works with, and the process of helping them to give strategically. We cover some of the thinking around how to choose which charities to support and what makes an effective charity, the pressure of trying to make the perfect decision, and the inevitable need to take risks. We also talk about the debate between trust-based philanthropy and more data-driven approaches, trends in philanthropy and grant-making, including the change in attitudes of the younger generation and increased collaboration between grant-makers. Emma also introduces us to her new book, co-authored with Beth Breeze, Advising Philanthropists, Principles and Practice. It's available to order now from the Directory of Social Change, and they believe it's the first ever book specifically on philanthropy advice. I hope you enjoy this episode, and please do send me a message or post a review on your podcast player to let me know what you think. Emma Beeston is an independent philanthropy advisor to philanthropists, families and foundations. Her advice guides donors from exploring their values through to implementing their giving to achieve their philanthropic goals. Emma specialises in supporting those new to philanthropy and facilitating multi-generational giving. Prior to her current role, Emma's worked for grant-making organisations including Children in Need, Lloyds Bank Foundation and Comic Relief. Emma co-created with Beth Breeze the Advising Donors module for the Philanthropic Studies Master's Degree Programme at the University of Kent. She's also a lecturer on the Philanthropy, Grant-Making and Social Investment Master's Degree Programme at Bayes Business School, they're both a bit of a mouthful, and a trainer with the Association of Charitable Foundations. She wants philanthropy to be accessible to all and is co-founder of a giving circle, Bath Women's Fund. And she's also just co-authored the book Advising Philanthropists with Beth Breeze, which can now be ordered online. And so I'm sure we'll get into that during the conversation at some point. So welcome to the podcast, Emma. How are you today?
Thanks, Alex. That's very nice to get an introduction. Thank you.
So what I thought we'll do is start off just by kind of setting some context and maybe kind of a couple of definitions before we get into stuff. So apologies for people already in the world of philanthropy if the first 5 minutes or so is a bit basic, but I'm sure it'll be helpful for people that are less familiar, and then we'll get into the detail. So the word philanthropy itself can be defined in a number of ways. Like any form of giving can be philanthropy, but then often when we talk about philanthropy, we often think about the really high value stuff. So I think we could start off by just kind of defining what we mean when we talk about philanthropy for the sake of this conversation. And then if you could just give us a bit of a kind of introduction to what a philanthropy advisor does.
Cool. Not easy on that. What is philanthropy? It's a massive question, and I'm not sure I feel like I should have a better definition.
I mean, just for the purposes of how we're using it today in this conversation, are we talking about the broadest sense, or are we talking about the high value stuff? Are we talking about individuals as opposed to foundations, or are we talking about those things kind of as a together as one?
Yeah. It's a tricky one. So I tend to think in a sort of very shorthand, I kind of swap philanthropy and giving around, because philanthropy is kind of, well, it's hard to say, and it comes with a lot of baggage. So it's important that it's not disconnected, I think, from giving, as opposed to like something like impact investing. But I also think when you think of philanthropy, you think of, generally a white male American tech billionaire. And I think it's important that philanthropy is seen as wider than that other people can and are philanthropists. And the difference between philanthropy and giving is often described as sort of philanthropy being maybe a bit more strategic and more about the root causes sometimes. I tend to think of it about giving that's kind of intentional and thoughtful. I think sometimes people can have strategies that are very much about donating, and that's fine, and giving. So yeah, for me, it's about having, for somebody to come and approach me as an advisor, I am working with people who have a significant amount of money to give, because otherwise they wouldn't be going to an advisor and paying me to help them. So there is a reality in my day-to-day that I'm working with people who've got significant amounts of money to give, and they're looking to do that with thought and with care and to do it well. And that's where I think I tend to sit with kind of what is that philanthropy looking like.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we're talking about both individuals, families, and foundations as kind of, that group of potential sort of clients that you work with.
Yeah, it's blurry. So sometimes individuals, sometimes couples, sometimes families, sometimes they're giving through a donor advised fund, sometimes there's a foundation, and sometimes I'm working with a foundation, so a more kind of formal structure, advising them. So and they that might have had historic family roots, but is now kind of paid staff, and it's much more like a grant making charity. So they do blur a little bit.
And just to give a sense of sort of scale, when we talk about significant amounts of money to give away, what's the sort of range that we're talking about? What's the sort of lower end of the sort of clients you work with? What would be like the smallest gift that they give to an individual charity, and what would be the kind of upper end of it?
Yeah, and you have to remember that I'm a small philanthropy advisor, so I work independently. I work on my own, so
Sure.
I can only work with a small number of clients because I've only got so many days. So there are different philanthropy advisors who will work with larger givers. So I tend to work with people who are giving, I would say, around about $1 million a year. So anywhere sort of 500,000, $1 million to 3 million a year, that kind of level of giving.
Sure. And just in terms of the sort of individual gifts that they would make within that million, is it kind of, starting from 1,000 or 10,000, or does it vary in terms of whether they want to give lots and lots of smaller gifts versus 1 or 2 500,000 gifts?
Alex, you'll just hear me say it depends a lot.
Yeah.
They're all interlinked, but if you think about people's resources, it's actually, if you're giving lots and lots of small grants, like with any funder, that volume grant making needs a lot of resource. It tends to be more kind of open call, and you have teams of people that process applications and make decisions. So if you don't have a staff, and you're potentially doing things that are a little bit more strategic, you're more likely to be working with a small number of partners. So we are talking about larger amounts of size grants. So I'm going to pick figures out of the air, but sort of your 50,000 upwards to an organization. I would say something around about like that. And there will also be smaller discretionary kind of gifts as well.
Sure. Yeah. It's just to frame the conversation a little bit, really, because I think I'm sure we'll sort of talk in broader terms at some points, but I suppose on the whole, we'll be drawing on your own experience of working directly with philanthropists. I guess that's the kind of most interesting kind of insight to gain. So yeah, it's just useful to kind of start to build a sense of those types of clients that you have. Where should we start with it then? So I suppose what would be useful then is to understand what's the sort of process or the sort of journey that people go through if they come to you. I think you mentioned that you often work with people that are relatively new to philanthropy. So in that kind of case, they come along and they've what's the sort of starting point, and how do you kind of take them through that thought process?
So yeah, I work with people, I guess most simply in terms of being a philanthropy advisor, I work with people kind of to help them work out what it is they want to do, and then to help them to do that. So it'll take different shapes. Some, if they're coming out at the start, which is quite common. They'll want to do some good, they'll be thinking about it, but as you know, the options are massive. Exactly where could you give, who do you give to, you know, all of that, let alone the process of doing it. And so people can quite easily get stuck. And then you put that in that context of, you know, they don't want to make a mistake, they don't want the money to get wasted, they don't want to do any harm. And we've got a kind of media backlog of scrutiny saying that, you know, rich people are awful and philanthropists are ego-driven people. So it's actually quite a difficult space when you come in and go, I'd like to do some good, and then it's all a bit overwhelming. So that's often where I work with people. And so I have a kind of a practical role, which is helping them navigate through the different options. And then it's also about, I guess, building people's confidence and adding knowledge about philanthropy and how it all works, so that they feel like it is something that they want to do and can go ahead and get on with. It's kind of giving permission sometimes to not be perfect and not to get it right. And there's this sense that there's this magic answer, that everybody has all these opinions on what philanthropy shouldn't be like, and therefore you feel like you're kind of missing the trick because you haven't worked out exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. So it's quite a baffling world if you're new to it. So that's where I can help with people. So it's conversations, you know, if we're starting from scratch, it's looking at people's values, looking at amount of motivation, thinking about what giving means to them, how they've done it in the past, what they want to get from it. So a lot starting with them to try and identify kind of cause areas to kind of narrow it down, and then bringing in that kind of challenge of reality, I suppose. So it's kind of saying, okay, if this is your area of interest, these are the issues going on, here are the gaps, here is good practice, this is, you know, these are people you might want to talk to or connect with. So it's very much steering, kind of starting from where they are usually, and then kind of what the world needs them to be in that area that they've chosen.
And so is that broadly the sort of first step, is narrow it down to a particular cause area, or maybe kind of narrowing it to one or two or three areas, as opposed to that kind of, you know, the whole landscape. And then from there, then starting to understand the particular cause area and what the kind of key issues are, and starting to learn about who does what and where they might kind of fit into that.
Exactly. And I think it's really hard. I try not to be kind of prescriptive on philanthropy should be one way or another, but I really don't see how you can manage without narrowing it down in some way, because otherwise, especially if we're talking, you know, £1 million, it will vanish very quickly. So I do think sometimes with a family, there are different strands of interest, and that's absolutely fine. So it might be, like you say, a small number, or it might be one clear focus. I know there's a challenge on that, because there's an argument in philanthropy that it shouldn't be led by the donor's preferences who gets the money. Obviously, there's a very important challenge to that. And some people would say certain causes are more important than others, need money more than others. So there's always a tension if you're just led by what the donor wants to do, what the philanthropist wants to do. But the only way I know that to keep motivated and to keep learning and to keep dealing with the difficulties is to have something that you care about, that's kind of propelling you forward and giving you that energy and enthusiasm and passion. And I think that's kind of interesting tension.
Yeah, I think if it comes to like personal money that a philanthropist, you know, an individual or a family want to give away, then unless they're saying they want to fund something that is doing some harm or is kind of has clearly been proven to be completely ineffective, then I kind of find it's hard to argue that it shouldn't just be up to them what they want to give it towards, because it's kind of like it. If I'm the philanthropist, it's like, well, it's my money. If I want to support animal causes as opposed to children, or if I want to support an arts organisation or whatever it might be, that's kind of up to me. And there's no there's no real kind of direct way of comparing across different causes or different organisations in some ways. So,
I mean, I agree, because at the heart, philanthropy is voluntary and you don't have to do it. So I think that's really important, because it is about people's expression of their personal values. And I sometimes think what would happen if you were kind of allocated a cause, say you've got to deal with, I don't know, the ethics of AI, and I've got to deal with something to do with carbon sequestering. And if that's not something I care about, however important and lovely it is, I'm just not going to be giving it the attention and the thought and the interest that will help you get better at understanding that. That said, you can see that if people who are wealthy give to what they know and their experience, then you get the situation like we have, where people are giving to universities, giving to museums, giving to sort of high arts. And actually, I think it is our role to say, if you're giving to the arts, then thinking about who's missing, who's not gaining access, which arts are not considered valuable in society, and is there something that you can do that supports kind of wider access, or other areas of arts that maybe you haven't come across. So I think there is a role to kind of expand and extend people's thinking. So if you want to give to climate and it's about cleaning up the river here, but actually I think I would be saying, as many others have, you might want to think about the global south, where actually the issue is bigger, it's with them now, and they're not the ones that have created the problem. So there's a duty there. So I think, as I mentioned before, there is always this tension of, you want to support people to do what they want to do, but you've also got a little bit of kind of questioning, challenging, pushing, to help them think about it in a wider context.
Yeah, I suppose it's more nuanced, isn't it? It's about kind of setting out, here's the whole picture and here are the different options, and you're an advisor, so you can advise, this is what I think would have the most impact, but ultimately it's their choice as to which particular area they might support.
And they don't have to listen to me, and they don't always, and that's absolutely fine. But I think about saying, look, you're entering this world, it is more complicated, and I think, than people might think. But there is a myth that giving is easy, and it isn't, to do it well. So I think there is a duty to kind of introduce people to the complexity without putting them off.
And there are so many myths, aren't there, around charities and charity effectiveness, and how you assess, which particular organisation to support, and all of those sorts of things. What's your experience of how people think about choosing individual charities to support? So maybe once you've done some of that work around identifying a particular cause area, you've got to know that kind of issue a bit more. And I suppose, it'd be useful to understand before that, for your clients, typically, are they doing calls for proposals and people making applications, and are they open calls or invitations, or are they kind of choosing who they're going to support and then making that, probably having a meeting and doing things like that, but essentially then making the choice and making that gift? So what's the sort of process, and then understanding how they choose to support one versus another in any kind of given field?
So generally, if we're talking about kind of individuals and families, at the level that I'm talking, it tends to be proactive giving rather than issuing an open call. If they're working in quite a broad space, and actually an open call would be the best way of finding who's working in that area and who's good, then I would encourage kind of collaboration and piggybacking of funders who are already working in that area. So they've already got the resources, who've already got the systems in place and processes. So giving money to another funder and who's got the grant making apparatus makes a lot of sense. So I'd certainly encourage collaboration and partnership in those situations. If they've got an area that's quite niche and it's relatively easy to do kind of desk-based research or ask for recommendations, or kind of root around and find out who's working in an area, then you can do that proactively quite effectively, and it saves people's time compared to an open call. So if you go and you can kind of go, I'm interested in this area, actually there's only, in whatever country it is, there's only a small number of groups working in that area. That's really helpful because you can do all the research on all the public information available on them. You can look at which looks like a likely match, which looks like they're doing good work, and then ask for a meeting, convene those conversations. Sometimes there's a proposal and a sort of written formality to it. Sometimes it's conversation. So it's very much coming from that kind of do your homework first and then reach out and make a connection with the people that are actually there doing the work. So that's probably the most common way it works.
So before we go on to the second part of the question, can I just jump in? So that idea, which makes a lot of practical sense around kind of giving the money to an existing funder who already funds in that particular cause area and already has an open call for applications, it makes sense. But how do people feel about that? Because I would imagine that would feel a lot less satisfying than giving a couple of big gifts to particular charities and, you know, engaging with them, meeting the chief exec and learning about the work they do more in depth, as opposed to handing it over to another funder who then gives it out to however many different charities. So do you get that pushback? Or
yeah, I suppose it's usually the driver. I mean, it's how you sort of frame it. I suppose it's usually the driver is that people just don't want to get involved in the admin side, but they do still want to hear how things are. They may want to be involved in decision making. They may put some parameters around it. They may, you know, still want to learn and meet and be part of conversations. So it's not just necessarily a kind of have the money and off you go. And when I say funder, I think you might be immediately jumping to maybe quite a big one. And actually some of them are already kind of small family trusts, and it's quite close work anyway. It's not like a huge organization, but it's kind of a, well, you're already doing this, can we help you? I've been pleasantly surprised about how little ego there often is. I think if you are, our typical view of a philanthropist is quite ego driven, and that really isn't my experience of people, you know, not wanting naming, not wanting profile, not wanting, you know, a lot of attention, but just want to know that they're doing good, is really the genuine, authentic motivation. So it's not as big an issue as you might think.
Interesting.
Bearing in mind, I always have to say this, that I work with a very small self-selecting sample of people I work with.
Yeah, and I
very
guess
lucky that there's not a lot of ego.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of bias in that sample, isn't there, in that they've chosen to seek out an advisor to help them make those decisions. And yeah, I suppose philanthropists that I've met in my career have probably been more at the stage of kind of wanting to do it all themselves, and so have been wanting more involvement in that kind of process.
And some of them do because they want, and like you say, if it makes sense to choose a small number of organizations and have relationships with them, that's really good. But it's not that they're being driven to do it themselves. They actually are wanting that kind of level of engagement. So it's not an ego driven desire, I don't think.
And then the second part of the question was the part about how you choose individual organizations. And so you mentioned some of the process around, let's maybe take the example of if you're doing it proactively and you've identified there's a handful of organizations working in that space, in that kind of geographic area, how do you assess which of those appears to be most effective or doing good work? You know, what are some of the factors that you kind of look at there?
I think hopefully it'll be the kind of usual things that get looked at, say kind of looking at governance, at financials, at strategy, at leadership, you know, the usual things. If yeah. I'm going to have another it depends, Alex, because it also depends, you know, if it's very competitive in that space, then you have a higher bar, don't you? of which ones therefore you're looking for, because you can pick and choose the strongest. If you're trying to build an area, then you can accommodate the fact that they're not as good at something. You know, their track record isn't great, but they've got a really good connection with that community and they've got a lot of expertise in that area. So that it's always a bit of a weighing up, because you're not always looking for the shiniest, strongest, you know, best track record. Sometimes in a particular field, it might be more important to help, you know, smaller, more grassroots organizations develop and back them for other reasons. So there's the sort of technical, the kind of governance, due diligence, risk appetite, is that all kind of matching up? But then there's also the things like the ethos, and you know, just how well they're connected, what their expertise is, what they're trying to do, because sometimes there's no track record but there's an aspiration, and you're basically taking a punt to back an organization that looks good. I think what always kind of matters is that the organization is kind of confident in where it's at, so they know why they do what they do, why they've chosen the particular approach that they have. And out of everything, that's the bit that I think comes across, however you want to cut it, on which bits of, you know, policies you're looking at, or the sort of the drier stuff. It's always down to, do they know what they're doing? And can they basically talk to you about that, which gives you confidence that they know what they're doing, they're honest about it. Here are the challenges, here's what we're trying to do, this is what we know, this is what we've tried. And if you can get to that open conversation, that's always the most beneficial, to kind of really get a sense of an organization and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right to me. I think, as you say, there's that sort of finance and governance type stuff. You can kind of look at the accounts and things like that, and kind of, you know, it's more a case of ticking the box that there's nothing that concerns you, I suppose, more often than anything else. And you, I suppose, you know, if we're talking about good organizations, let's assume that all of that stuff is in place. And then you're looking more at that question of trying to assess how effective is this organization at delivering on that mission. The mission aligns with what the funder, what the philanthropist wants to do. So how effective are they in that? And I think that's the really interesting area, because it's quite difficult to kind of codify that. And I suppose that's why it's been debated for so many years by people working in charities and in philanthropy and in fundraising, and kind of at all angles. And in most cases, there isn't the kind of robust academic or scientific evidence to show one intervention or another works really well. In a small number of cases, that's there, but more often than not, it isn't, or not to that level.
And I also think you've got to remember that philanthropy, one of its strengths is that you can take risks, and it hasn't got the accountability that, you know, your local authority grant scheme would have. So that is quite a luxury position to be. Now, you'll get some philanthropists who are absolutely driven by the data and the evidence and the metrics, and they want a theory of change and they want to see the impact. And, you know, that's one approach, and that's good. But you'll have others where it's much more, I believe in what you're trying to do, I trust you to do it, I'm basically giving in solidarity with your work as a contribution. And they're less worried about the impact, or the impact is going to be years down the line, contested, you know, tricky to measure, tricky to pin down. So I think it's really, we all know it's really hard to go, you know, let's line everything up, let's assess it all, and let's say which one has the most impact. I know there'll be researchers and scientists who will argue with me, but I think, you know, it's a really hard thing to do, because you're just not, you're just not comparing. And sometimes I think philanthropists are in a nice position where they can take a punt, because it's up to them, and it's their money, and if it doesn't work, then they're lucky. Other people argue, therefore, you're wasting precious resources. But I think, again, we're back to that lovely tension and nuance in the messy middle.
Yeah. But I think I would agree with you in that having those conversations with people, you get that sense of, do you really know what you're talking about? Do I trust that you're really involved in it? You really know the communities that you're there to serve, and you really understand the issues, and you're working collaboratively where it makes sense to, and all of those kinds of things. Yeah, as I say, it's difficult to kind of objectively codify and measure that. So it brings up another challenge, doesn't it? In that, then sometimes it's the organisations who have the leaders that are able to articulate those things, and others that maybe are less able to, then miss out for those sorts of reasons, although the work they're doing might be every bit as good. So yeah, it's just such an interesting, messy field, isn't it, in terms of trying to navigate all of those things. And you, as you said at the beginning, that's where the overwhelm can come in, isn't it, when you're trying to put the money to best use, and there's no kind of clear, perfect way of doing it. You just have, as you say, you have to kind of take that risk and make that punt at some point.
You put that really well, Alex. And it also, I think it gives that sense that you're the only one, and that you have to get it perfectly. Whereas actually, there will be government funding, there'll be other funding, there'll be other funders, there'll be other philanthropists. Yeah. And so hopefully between you cover what matters and is what important, and you can affect change. So it's not, I think it's quite a pressured place to think I'm one person that's going to affect this change, and I've got to get it absolutely right in order for, not make any mistakes, in order for this not to be kind of a massive failure. And I think that puts too much pressure on people as well.
Yeah.
The focus on the conversation, I think, is quite interesting, because you're right, some people are better about talking about what they do than others. I think enlightened leaders who aren't very good at, who recognize themselves that they're not the most articulate, and bring other people, project workers that can talk about the work, that's always really good. But you do always have to question, I think, like, who's missing, who have I not spotted because they haven't got that profile but will be doing really good work. And who, certainly if you're trying to search proactively, it's much easier if there's something very clear. So if somebody's working with, I don't know, say it's mental health, young people's mental health, you can find charities that are very much about young people's mental health, but there'll be all sorts of other groups that will be supporting young people's mental health, but it'll be called something else. It'll be boxing, or it'll be, and that's when I think it can be quite tricky on the proactive side of things to actually be able to identify good work that will be happening, but because it's not labeled a certain way, you're going to miss. That's tricky.
Yeah. And again, it's even if you've narrowed it down to young people's mental health, then there's so much more narrowing down to do, isn't there, in terms of, is it people with very complex needs and acute mental health issues? Is it taking a more kind of preventive approach, and people kind of further down that pathway? Is it, as you say, is it using things like sport to improve mental health, or is it more kind of counselling and different types of interventions, and just so many different types of approaches? Do you want to support a small local one in one particular area, or a national one that's kind of raising awareness and addressing policy issues and things? So much to consider.
And that's exactly a philanthropy advice conversation. Trying to go, right, let's kind of cut chase. So it's partly interest, and then it's partly, is the research, is there evidence, is there research, what people are saying. And I think in those conversations, what's also really nice thing is that you can ask people what they need and what they want, as opposed to sort of, you're not going in saying we're looking to fund XYZ. You can just say, what's going on, where are the gaps, what do you need, what are your priorities, what can we help with? And that's a nice position to be in. to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think there's some really interesting examples in the kind of richest people in the world, biggest philanthropy kind of individuals as well, isn't it? When you look at the moment, the kind of juxtaposition between Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Scott, who, on the one hand, you've got Jeff Bezos saying, well, I've got to, get it exactly right, and kind of putting that pressure of doing things in the right way and saying, this philanthropy business, it's really, really hard, isn't it? I don't know, that will get there eventually, but I've got to work out all this stuff. And then you've got Mackenzie Scott saying, yeah, well, we did some research, we found some good organizations, and we gave them really big amounts of money and let them get on with it.
Yeah.
Really, really sort of different approaches. And then thinking back, I suppose the previous generation in a way of those really large scale philanthropists, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, kind of taking that very focused approach of this, working out where they're going to invest and really getting into it. And then Warren Buffett saying, well, they've done all that work. Why would I duplicate that? I'll just give all of my money to them and they can do what they're going to do with it.
Yeah. And it's always, it's why it's such a good space to work in, because it's endlessly fascinating, and these debates are technically challenging but also philosophical and spiritual and political all mixed in. So yeah, this debate between the kind of trust-based approaches and the more kind of directed approaches is going to be running for quite a few years. I think it's interesting times. And then you've got the younger generation and making huge sweeping assumptions, but that are very interested in kind of wealth inequality and justice, and obviously climate as well. So that's bringing change of itself as well. So looking more at, why do I have this money and what is it for and what am I going to do with it, beyond just, I've made my money and I'm going to give it away. It's kind of challenging the whole system, which is interesting.
And is that sort of thinking of a younger generation, is that particularly where they've inherited that wealth, or is that kind of across the board where they're young people that have made significant wealth as well? Or...
Yeah, I suppose from my experience, it's younger people who have kind of inherited it, or it's family business. It is the money is coming from there, rather than at the moment those that have made it for themselves. I'm sure others will be supporting them, but from my experience, it's more the next generation coming into a family who are sort of thinking about the money, and not just them coming in, but like there's lots of conversations about from the other generations about kind of not wanting to give your children too much money, and there's quite a lot of people that have come out and talked about that, about not wanting to leave money to their children and not wanting to give them too much, not wanting it to be a burden. So we got the two attitudes kind of coming together, which is quite interesting.
And on the other trend you mentioned around the kind of trust-based philanthropy across to the sort of directed and data-driven type of approach, do you see shifts in that conversation, or do you think that's just going to be those two opposing kind of schools of thought that are going to run along forever, or do you see a particular kind of direction of travel at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure as which way it's going to settle, actually. I think we're very good at polarizing things, and so my hunch is that we'll settle somewhere in the middle, because if you have got evidence for something working better than something else, why would you ignore it? But also those groups themselves wouldn't be ignoring it. So I think it's a funny space. I think it's more about, and sometimes I think somebody with a vision and a lot of money that backs, can drive through a lot of change that might be positive. So I'm a little bit pragmatic in the middle soul, I'm afraid, and I obviously trust and listening to communities had been kind of squished down, and that's the one that's on the rise. But I read an article just this morning which was this new fad means all our giving is going to least effective approaches. So there is that pushback, and I don't think it's going to settle for a while. It's not a very rubbish answer, Alex, sorry. I suppose I'm thinking that, I kind of think that both matter if you've got them. So if you're supporting a social movement of activists that are, campaigning for a change, I'm not sure what the point of measuring much there is. You're hoping that, you can see who they are, you can look at their reach, you can look at their messages, you can look at what they're trying to do, but I'm not sure how meaningful research is to wanting to do that kind of work, versus sometimes you've got, I don't know, something that's been tried and didn't work, and you've got evidence to say it, so why would you do it again? So they've both got a value. I think on research, there's a lot of really, on the sort of evidence side, there's a lot of really interesting work around the sort of ethics of evaluation and equity in research, because it's very much who gets to decide what topics get looked at when you're looking at impact for who's asking what question, so it's very much that kind of data size is getting caught up, quite rightly, with kind of issues of equity and community and ethics. And so I think a messy middle will be winning out as per usual, in that a bit of both, and it'll depend.
Yeah, it always depends. I think it's I always kind of think of it as being a spectrum of, you've got the two ends of it, and then most philanthropists and funders are kind of dotted along that line somewhere in the middle. There are some that are kind of at the polar ends, and then most of them are somewhere along that path, maybe closer to one end or the other, or bang in the middle, and some that move along, and some that move backwards and forwards. I think there are certain funders that, go to much more kind of quantitative approaches and then shift back to more kind of relational approaches and kind of swing backwards and forwards a bit.
Yeah, I mean, say you were say you wanted to support museums, so you could be looking at, the numbers of people in that museum, you could look at who's coming to that museum, you could do measurements of kind of what they get from it, you could probably look at something about the quality of their experience and what they're getting and what they're seeing. But then you've got things like, should those artifacts be in the museum, or should they be returned to the country of origin? I'm not sure what metrics would make you go, right, okay, we'll return the statues to Benin. It's about ethics, isn't it? And a lot of the time, sometimes it's much more values driven or solidarity driven, and I think that's good. I think you probably need both. I can whitter away about this. It's very nice talking to you about this, Alex. Very nicely.
It's all interesting stuff. Are there any other particular kind of issues or trends that we want to pick up on around philanthropy and grant making? It's okay if you think we've kind of covered the main ones. I'm just going to cut the question, but I don't know what else we might want to pick up.
Yeah. So for me, I think when I worked in grant making, which is a while ago now, the issues of kind of power were known, but weren't really getting much traction. So I do think, slightly ironic, but after I've left, I think grant making has got a lot more interesting. And I think the fact that it is shifting and changing and being more dynamic rather than being quite a comfortable place to be, I think is really good. So I love seeing the change, and that people are not just going, well, this is our system and this is how we do it and this is our focus, but are questioning, themselves and thinking about what they contribute and how they create blocks and barriers. I think that's great. I think what I find really intriguing is where we're going to get with technology. So at the moment, we're at the point where AI can write a grant bid, and we have grant management software that can has algorithms that it can assess a bid. So you've completely lost, potentially, you can lose the human out of the grant making process. And I'm quite intrigued by that, because I think there's lots of good reasons for using technology to address bias and things like that. But I do think if we start taking people out of the grant making process, I kind of think we're missing the point, that we're talking about love and we're talking about compassion and we're talking about helping, and if an algorithm's talking to an algorithm, what are we left with? So I don't have any answers, but I think that's a fascinating trend that we have just at the start of seeing what that might look like. There's already been sort of experiments on randomized grant making, and I'm a little bit nervous for taking humans completely out of the system, not just as a profession and losing jobs, but just what are we saying if it is this bid A hits target XYZ and gets money? Is that fair? Is that better? Is that quicker? Or are we losing something?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it would work in practice in terms of the kind of application side of things, because I think there are obviously certain elements that could be done automatically and would definitely be beneficial, all of the kind of organizational information, the stuff from the accounts, rather than having someone individually inputting that each time they write a bid. But in terms of explaining the need that's being addressed and how the work's delivered and the outcomes it generates and things like that, I'm not sure how an AI would be able to do that without a human feeding it the information, or a human putting all the relevant information onto the charity's website for an AI to then kind of go and capture it. So it might be that the process is different, but I don't think you can take the human out of it. Or maybe I'm just not up on the latest tech enough to understand quite how it works.
I think you're right. I don't think we're not there yet. And of course, data has to come in from somewhere. And clearly, grant makers should just be reading the accounts anyway. But that's beside the point. But I'm a bit of, no, I'm not a Luddite. I like technology for a lot of reasons, but I'm slightly nervous about some of the simplification of this whole transaction, when actually it is, like you say, about conveying complex information, and it's about people. And I'm a little bit unsure about how we'll go technology wise. I think it's an interesting trend, but I hope you're right in that we won't be able to do it. And maybe a more positive trend that I think is good, and we touched on, but is that increase in collaboration and collective giving. And yeah, I think that's good. I think that's obviously came out of kind of COVID, and that sense of, the world is got so many urgent issues, we kind of need to pull together to address them. But I think the fact that has lasted is a good sign. And there's a growth in, I obviously co-founded the Giving Circle, but I think we see a growth in that interest in giving together. And I think that's a real positive.
Is that something that's happening more so now, do you think? So I can't put my finger on a lot of examples of it, I don't think. I know during the pandemic there were a few. I suppose London Community Response Fund was probably the most obvious one. There may be one or two others, but I've not noticed seeing more now than kind of before then.
If you go on the, ACF have got their Funders Collaborative Hub.
Yeah.
If you go on there, when that first came out, there were only a few on there, and now there are loads. And some of them are big collaborations, some of them are small, but it definitely feels like, whether the reality has shifted, it definitely feels like there's an appetite, and it's something that people will automatically kind of look for. Right, who is working on this? Can we work together in a way that I don't think was there before?
No, that's good. And I suppose it's that collaboration that's a little bit less visible. So I suppose I'll see it if like there's a fund that you can apply to, and you see there are multiple funders who have put money into it, and then there's a kind of central place that you're going to. Whereas, of course, funders will collaborate in different ways. just in less visible ways in terms of potentially funding together or potentially just navigating that a particular space in terms of who's doing what and that side of things, which is, you know, really valuable as well.
Yeah, you're right. There would be pooled funds, but yeah, there's also these networks that are about, you know, even if you have like a shared one person, you know, all together looking at the research in an area rather than everybody doing it
Yeah.
separately, or seeing if you can come up with one outcomes framework for everybody can use again, rather than having
Yeah.
several million different ones. So I think those, it's part, maybe sometimes just about conversations and knowledge exchange, but I do think that there'll be more pooled funding as well on the back of that.
Yeah. Probably getting close to wrapping. Oh, we've not spoken about the book at all. Do you want to tell us a bit about what the book's all about and where people can find it?
Yeah, so it's with co-written with Beth Breeze, and as far as we know, we think it's the first book on advising philanthropists. So the reason we wrote it is because we teach advising donors as part of the Kent Masters course. There isn't a lot of information. All the information is about, you know, philanthropy and about how to do it, how not to do it. But there is this whole ecosystem around philanthropists that are advising them that just are not well known and not well understood. So the book is very much an introduction to that world. So independent philanthropy advisors like me, but, you know, people working in banks or in community foundations and different spaces and focused on, you know, maybe the arts, or focused on effective altruism, or focused on different things. So there's a mixture of people. And what we got to do, which was lovely, because through COVID and the whole lockdown, we got access to people that we wouldn't normally get access to online. So we interviewed over 40 different philanthropy advisors around the world and just got them to tell us what they do and how they work. So the book's got portraits of some of them throughout the book, as well as quotes from lots of them. So it's very much about kind of what is philanthropy advice, who are these people, what are they doing, what, you know, what's the process day to day, but also what are the ethical kind of decisions involved in doing this work, which we've kind of touched on earlier, about kind of how much are you supporting somebody, how much of you challenging somebody. So those kind of issues that are really hard to navigate, we kind of discuss as well. And then looking at philanthropy advice kind of in a wider context, so and the wider world. So what is its kind of responsibility beyond itself? And yeah, we think it's the first one, so it's very exciting. It's certainly the first book I've written, so that's been a whole journey. And yeah, it's very nice that it's finally, I've seen the cover and it's nearly there.
Awesome. And who is it? Just for anyone that's interested in philanthropy, or are there kind of particular audience in terms of who would benefit reading it?
I think because it's a first, it's quite introductory, it's working quite hard. So it's partly it'll be of interest to people who are working as philanthropy advisors, because you get to hear what other people are doing in a way that you maybe don't normally, and or people that are thinking about being a philanthropy advisor. But I also think, you know, if you're, you know, a fundraiser and you're trying to get your head around who these advisors are, I come from the point that we're allies in this and we should be working together. So hopefully it'll give people some insight, and the same as sort of charity leaders. And I think we're also looking, not just us, but, you know, there's a whole sort of movement, I suppose, looking at that wealth management, financial management industry, to make sure that people are aware that philanthropy is a choice within that kind of within your financial options, and that actually it would be great if your accountant or your tax person or your wealth manager, you know, started saying, what about your philanthropy, what have you thought? And so we'd love to see it being just more accepted that it's a thing, and philanthropy advice is useful and has a value, and is something that actually we raising philanthropy with clients is a good thing to be doing. So we're reaching out to everybody. We're trying to persuade the world that
Yeah.
philanthropy crisis is quite unknown, and actually I think it's be good to grow it and grow awareness of what people are doing.
Well, thank you very much for joining and for chatting through everything. It was really interesting, and hope the book launch goes well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's nice to be there finally.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Charity Impact Podcast, and thank you for listening all the way to the end. Just one more thing before you go. If you listen to the podcast, I'd love to hear what you think. You can either leave a review on Spotify, Apple, etc., or tag me in a post on LinkedIn or Twitter at alexblake_KEDA, or just drop me an email. For details on all episodes with notes and links to resources, head to our website, kedaconsulting.co.uk. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, take care.